So today we're tackling a real giant of American thought, John Dewey.
A giant is absolutely the right word.
I mean, if you're preparing for a meeting or just trying to get a handle on intellectual history or, just curious about how our modern world even functions.
You've run into his shadow.
Exactly. How we learn, how we solve problems as a society, how democracy is supposed to actually work. His ideas are just everywhere.
And think about the time he was alive. Born in 1859, lives all the way to 1952.
It's just an incredible span. You're talking about the aftermath of the Civil War through 2 world wars and right into the atomic age.
He saw arguably the most intense transformation in American history. And he wasn't just a bystander. He was, without a doubt, the most prominent American scholar of the entire first half of the 20th century.
Okay, and the sheer volume of his work is, well, it's intimidating.
It's staggering. It really is. We're talking more than 700 articles and something like 140 different journals, and that's on top of about 40 books. And the topics cover everything: epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, social theory, journalism, you name it.
So that brings us to our mission for you, the listener, in this deep dive. His body of work is immense, almost, unwieldy. So our goal is to go in and pull out those absolutely crucial interconnected ideas that really defined his legacy. We're trying to give you a solid shortcut to understanding the philosopher.
And to do that, we have to start with the one thing that ties it all together.
The great overriding theme. Because without it, you're right, his work can feel really disparate. Like, what does a theory on psychology have to do with a classroom curriculum or the role of the press?
But there is a thread, and that thread was his profound, truly lifelong dedication to democracy.
But not just democracy in the sense of, voting every few years.
No, not at all. For him, it was so much more. He saw it as being synonymous with, and this is a quote, the one ultimate ethical ideal of humanity.
That's a powerful statement.
It's a mission statement. And he articulated it as early as 1888, when he was still a young professor at the University of Michigan. This was his North Star from the very beginning.
So this wasn't just some political preference or a side interest. This idea, this ethical ideal of democracy, it informed everything.
Everything. Whether he was writing about a child's psychology or the structure of civil society, it all came back to this one goal. How do we create the conditions for a fully functioning democracy? Which for him meant encouraging what he called experimental intelligence and plurality.
It sounds like society itself needed to be rebuilt from the ground up to support that ideal.
Precisely. He argued that this reconstruction had to happen in 2 absolutely foundational places: our schools and our civil society.
Because a complete democracy needs more than just the right to vote.
It requires a fully formed, robust public opinion. And that, he said, could only be achieved through open, critical communication among everyone: citizens, experts, political leaders.
So it puts a huge burden on the citizen. You can't just be a passive receiver of information. You have to be an active thinking participant in actually creating knowledge.
Absolutely. That's the high bar he sets. His ideas are, they're undeniably complex. The academic language can sometimes get in the way.
Sure.
But the driving force underneath it all is actually remarkably simple. How do we create a functioning cooperative democracy through thoughtful, reflective, and just ceaseless action?
Okay, let's unpack this then. That seems like the perfect place to start, with the philosophical engine that powered this whole massive enterprise.
We have to start with the schools of thought he's associated with. He's a central figure in American pragmatism, of course.
Of course. But he had his own preferred terms, didn't he?
He did. He was always very precise. While he was okay with the pragmatism label, he often preferred to call his own approach instrumentalism.
And he also saw links to consequentialism.
Yes. And these aren't just, splitting academic hairs. These labels signal a really fundamental shift in philosophy, away from this ancient search for some kind of eternal capital T truth.
Right.
And toward a system for validating ideas based on what they actually do in the real world.
Okay, so it's all about the results.
Right.
But that sounds a little dangerous. If it's just whatever works, that could justify anything. We know Dewey was incredibly rigorous, so how did he stop his instrumentalism from just becoming expediency?
That's the critical question, and you've really hit on the core of his rigor. He was very aware of that danger. When he was trying to define the actual criterion of validity for all 3 of those schools, pragmatism, instrumentalism, consequentialism, he laid out this incredibly precise definition.
The one from his big book on logic. Logic. The theory of inquiry.
That's the one. It sounds incredibly dense at first, but every single word matters.
Let's hear it.
Okay. He defined the criterion as the function of consequences as necessary tests of the validity of propositions.
All right, so breaking that down. The validity of an idea, a proposition, is tested by its results, its consequences. That part is clear.
Right.
But what makes those consequences a valid test? This is where the instrumental part comes in, I assume.
Exactly. This is the fine print that separates it from a simple whatever works mentality.
Yeah.
He adds a crucial condition. The consequences only count as a valid test provided.
Okay.
Provided those consequences are operationally instituted and are such as to resolve the specific problem evoking the operations.
Operationally instituted. That phrase feels like the engine of the whole thing. Let's really spend a minute on that.
It is the engine. Think of it like a scientist running an experiment in a lab, but you're applying that same level of rigor to a belief or an ethical claim or social policy.
So a proposition is like a hypothesis.
Exactly. And you don't just sit in your armchair and ponder whether your hypothesis is true in some abstract sense. You have to actively test it. You have to put it into practice in the world. That's what operationally instituted means, carrying out observable, verifiable steps.
Okay, let's use a real-world example, something that ties back to his interest in social problems. Let's say a city government has a belief, a proposition, that installing new streetlights in a high-crime neighborhood will reduce burglaries.
Perfect. Under Dewey's instrumentalism, you can't just validate that idea based on the good intention or the theory that light deters crime. You have to operationally institute it.
So you have to actually fund the project, buy the lights, install them, make sure they're maintained. The active application.
Yes. And then comes the second part of the criterion, which is just as vital. The consequences have to resolve the specific problem evoking the operations.
So it's not enough that something good happens in a general sense. Maybe the new lights make people feel safer or property values go up.
Right. Those might be nice side effects, but the test of validity is whether the lights specifically reduce the burglary rate. That was the specific problem that started the whole inquiry.
So if burglaries go down, the proposition, the belief in streetlights as a solution, is for now validated. It's instrumentally true in that context.
Provisionally validated, yes.
Yeah.
And if the burglary rate stays the same, or even goes up, then the proposition is nullified. The idea failed the test, and the process of inquiry has to start all over again with a new hypothesis.
That's a fantastic way to ground it. It's basically the scientific method applied to all beliefs. Everything is a hypothesis, and everything is subject to revision based on evidence.
And he was very much in dialogue with his peers on this. He wasn't working in a vacuum.
He had a lot of respect for the other great pragmatists.
A great deal. In his essays in experimental logic, he gives a shout out to Charles Sanders Peirce, who, funnily enough, actually got the word pragmatic from Immanuel Kant, using it to mean something that has empirical consequences.
And then there's William James, who is probably the most famous of the group, and gave pragmatism its most memorable slogan.
Right. James's famous line that general notions must cash in.
Great line.
It's a great line, but Dewey, while respecting James, felt it needed a bit of clarification to avoid that whatever works fallacy we were just talking about.
Right.
He pointed out that for James, cashing in didn't mean is it profitable? It meant the ideas must be translatable into verifiable specific things.
So it always comes back to that verifiable specific consequences that come from taking action. That's instrumentalism.
That's the heart of it.
Okay, so we have to talk about one of his biggest attempts to put all this together into one grand statement. His 1925 book, Experience in Nature. It's often called his most metaphysical work.
It is.
But the sources say he was really unhappy with how it was first received.
He was, yeah. The first edition just didn't land the way he wanted it to. Critics tried to sort of cram his ideas into the old philosophical boxes they were familiar with.
So he rewrote it.
He did. For the second edition in 1929, he rewrote the entire first chapter and added a new preface to make his intentions crystal clear.
And in that rewrite, he basically said he wasn't trying to fit in with the old philosophies at all.
Not at all. He came out and said he was presenting what we would now call a new Kuhnian paradigm, a whole new way of seeing things. He wasn't interested in continuity with the past. He was saying his ideas were incommensurable with the old ways of thinking. You couldn't even measure them by the old standards.
A total break.
Yeah.
And to emphasize just how revolutionary this was, he used this really striking quote about the book's title.
Yes. He knew people would stumble on the title itself, Experience and Nature. He wrote, "To many, the associating of the two words will seem like talking of a round square."
A round square. I mean, that's a powerful way to put it. Why were those two concepts, experience and nature, seen as so mutually exclusive in traditional philosophy?
Well, historically, philosophy loved to split reality in two. On one side, you had nature, the objective, external, real world, governed by fixed laws that science could measure.
Okay.
And on the other side, you had experience. And experience was seen as subjective, internal, the messy world of consciousness, feelings, interpretations, and, error.
So mind versus matter,
Yeah.
subject versus object.
Precisely. Dewey was trying to tear down that wall. He was arguing that experience isn't something that just happens inside our heads, separate from the world. Experience is a real event that is fully and inescapably part of nature itself.
He was trying to heal that split.
He was, and he knew you couldn't do it with just a simple argument. He said these old dualistic associations were too deeply ingrained in our language, so he hoped that by reading the whole book, the reader would insensibly produce, if one is fortunate, a change in the significations previously attached to them.
So it's not about winning a debate. It's about slowly converting the reader to a whole new worldview.
It's a vision of intellectual transformation, yeah. Built on this idea that your experience is a natural event, just like a thunderstorm or a chemical reaction.
It's amazing how that same rigor he applied to logic and philosophy.
Yeah.
It's the same functional approach he took to the human mind. And that leads us directly into his work as a founder of American psychology.
It's a perfect transition. You can actually trace this path through his early career, which is, well, it's a bit surprising.
He wasn't always a university philosopher.
Not at all. He started out as a teacher. He taught high school for 2 years in Pennsylvania and elementary school for a year in Vermont.
And he later said he was completely unsuited for it.
He did. Which is pretty ironic for the man who would go on to revolutionize education. But, he moved on, got his PhD from Johns Hopkins. And the real turning point was his arrival at the brand new University of Chicago in 1894.
Right, this is where the famous Chicago group forms.
This was a critical moment. He and his colleagues, James Hayden Tufts, George Herbert Mead, and one of his students, James Roland Angell, they started developing what became known as functional psychology.
And this was a direct challenge to the dominant psychological school of the time.
A very deliberate one. They were pushing back against the very rigid physiological psychology of Wilhelm Wundt in Germany and his American students.
So what was the big difference? What was the Chicago group's emphasis?
Well, Wundt's psychology was very structuralist. It tried to break the mind down into its basic components, almost like chemistry. The Chicago group said that's the wrong approach entirely.
Okay.
Their emphasis was on the influence of the social environment on the mind and on behavior. They wanted to understand the mind in action as an adaptive function in a real-world context. The mind wasn't a collection of static parts. It was something that did things.
And this new school of thought was really launched by one landmark paper in 1896.
The reflex arc concept in psychology. It's considered the first major statement of functional psychology. And it's just a brilliant piece of work because it challenges a really fundamental assumption.
The traditional model of the reflex arc.
Exactly. The old model was the simple linear chain. You have a stimulus, like a pinprick, that causes a sensation, the feeling of pain, which then causes a response. You pull your hand away.
ABC, like dominoes.
Like dominoes, separate, distinct links in a chain. Dewey argued against this. He said that's not how it works at all.
So he wasn't denying that the stimulus or the response exist, but he rejected the idea that they were separate events. What was his alternative, this circular account?
He defended what he called the unitary nature of the sensory motor circuit. The whole thing is one continuous dynamic process. It's a loop.
How so?
He argued that the stimulation is always being enriched by the results of previous experiences. The sensation isn't just raw data coming in, it's an active interpretation from the very start. And likewise, the response is constantly being modulated by sensorial experience as it happens.
Okay, let's use an example. A child sees a candle flame for the first time.
Right.
The old model says, flame, stimulus, causes pain, sensation, causes withdrawal, response.
Yeah.
How does Dewey's model see it differently?
Dewey would say, hold on. The act of seeing the flame and reaching for it is already a complex behavior, probably driven by curiosity based on prior experiences with interesting objects. The stimulus of the light isn't separate from the motor response of reaching.
Oh, I see.
And then the painful sensation immediately informs and reshapes the child's perception of flames in the future. It's not three separate events. It's one integrated dynamic loop where past knowledge shapes present perception, which in turn instantly shapes future action.
That's a profound shift. From seeing the mind as a machine to seeing it as an adaptive, functional system.
It was huge. And it's why he was so recognized in the field. He was president of the American Psychological Association in 1899, and then the American Philosophical Association in 1905.
And this functional view of the mind feeds directly into his work on logic. He saw logic itself not as a set of abstract rules, but as an instrument for investigating the world.
Absolutely. In his 1938 book, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, he points out this paradox he saw in the logical theory of his day.
The split between what logicians could agree on and what they just argued about endlessly.
Exactly. He said, when it comes to the proximate subject matter, the actual techniques and methods of reasoning, everyone basically agrees and we make progress. But when it comes to the ultimate subject matter, what is truth, what's validity, it's just constant, unresolvable controversy.
So he challenged them.
He did. He asked, are these logical operators just pure abstractions, like in math? Or do they actually connect with the real world and help us alter it or understand it better? For him, logic had to be an engaged process, an instrument for solving real problems.
And this goes back to his focus on precise language. He was engaging with logical positivism, but he had some critiques.
He did. He welcomed their shift in focus. The positivists were moving away from abstract terms like propositions and terms and focusing on the concrete reality of sentences and words.
Which he liked.
He liked it because it focused attention on the actual symbolic structures we use to communicate, but he also felt it narrows unduly the scope of what counts as a symbol.
Because symbols aren't just words on a page.
Of course not. What about a map? Or an architect's blueprint, or a clenched fist? Those are all powerful symbols, but we don't usually call them a word or a sentence. He stressed that you can't understand the intent of a symbol in isolation. You can only judge it by its context. If you miss the context, you miss the meaning.
This holistic, contextual approach led him to try and solve the massive terminology problem in epistemology. This was in his final major work with Arthur Bentley. Knowing and the known.
Right. They argued that so much of the confusion came from philosophers clinging to outdated ways of thinking about how things are organized and how they interact.
And they laid out 3 historical levels of this thinking.
Yes. The oldest, most primitive way of thinking they called self-action.
This is the idea that things act because of some power they have inside them. The ocean is angry, so the ship sinks.
Yeah.
That person is just evil. That's why they did a bad thing.
Exactly. It achieves causation to some fixed internal essence, very pre-scientific. The next level, which really dominated modern science for centuries, was interaction.
The Newtonian model.
Yeah.
Billiard balls colliding.
Perfect analogy. Here, things are balanced against each other in a system of equal and opposite reaction. It's systematic, it's measurable, but it still thinks in terms of separate, independent objects acting on each other, cause and effect between distinct entities.
And then the third level, the one they were proposing to deal with modern complexity, was transaction.
This is the big leap. In a transaction, you stop thinking about separate pre-existing entities. Transactionalism deals with the multiple aspects and phases of a whole action without breaking it down into ultimate, final, or independent entities.
Wait, I need a clear distinction here. How is transaction really different from interaction? It sounds a bit like systems theory.
It's a precursor to systems theory, for sure. The key difference is that interaction still assumes you have separate things that then act upon each other. A buyer and a seller, for example. Transactionalism says you can't even define the buyer without the seller or the seller without the buyer. They are mutually defining aspects of a single event, the purchase. You, the observer, the environment, the object being sold, it's all one complex situation. You can't pull them apart without destroying the meaning of the event.
Let's use a more complex social issue, say a citywide protest.
Great. From a self-action perspective, you'd say those protesters are inherently disruptive or the police are inherently oppressive. You assign the cause to a fixed internal nature.
Got it.
From an interaction perspective, you'd say the protesters marched, so the police responded with force. Action and reaction between two separate groups.
A more balanced view, but still separate.
Right. But the transactional approach demands you look at the entire system. You have to analyze the overlapping history of the community, the economic pressures, the media coverage, the political climate, the specific training of the officers, the motivations of the protesters, all of it as one indivisible event. You realize that the police and the protesters are being defined in and through that very situation.
That is a much more intellectually demanding way to look at the world. And if the goal of logic and philosophy is to help us navigate these complex transactions, then individuals need the right mental tools.
And that's where his definition of reflective thinking, from his 1910 book, How We Think, becomes the absolute foundation for everything else.
This is the blueprint for the intelligent citizen he wanted to create.
It is. He defines reflective thinking as an active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief in the light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it tends.
And that word active is doing all the work there.
All of it. Thinking is not passively soaping up information from a teacher or a news report. It's an active process of questioning, analyzing, testing beliefs against evidence, and then tracing those beliefs forward to see where they lead. What are their logical consequences?
And he laid out what well-executed thinking looks like versus poorly executed thinking.
He did. The difference is that reflective process. Poor thinking relies on habit, prejudice, or just accepting things without question. But well-executed thinking requires specific steps. Skepticism, followed by investigation, to find evidence that either supports or nullifies a belief.
It's the instrumental method applied to your own mind.
It's a systematic design for applying intelligence to life. And once he had that blueprint, it was obvious what the schools needed to do.
This connects everything. If your whole political and social philosophy depends on citizens being transactional, reflective thinkers, then the #1 job of the education system is to produce those citizens.
And this is where he really becomes the major voice for progressive education. Dewey was never going to let these ideas just stay in a book. He needed a laboratory.
The University of Chicago Laboratory Schools.
Yeah.
The Dewey School.
Exactly. This was his chance to put his theories into practice, to test them, to refine them. It was action research on a massive scale.
And his core beliefs, which he laid out in things like my pedagogic creed and democracy in education, they just turned the existing model of schooling on its head.
Completely. First, he said that education and learning are fundamentally social and interactive. You don't learn in a vacuum.
And from that flows his most radical idea for the school itself.
That the school is a social institution where social reform should and must take place. He saw the classroom as the primary engine for cultivating the habits of democracy. It's a micro-democracy in training.
Where the act of learning is supposed to mirror the act of civic engagement.
In every way. He believes students thrive when they're allowed to experience and interact with the curriculum. This is the bedrock of what we now call experiential education.
So the whole purpose of education shifts. It's not about cramming a predetermined set of facts into a student's head anymore.
No. The purpose is to help each student realize their full potential and gain the ability to use their skills for the greater good. His phrase was to give him command of himself so he would have the full and ready use of all his capacities.
He really saw the school as the most instrumental institution for social change.
Because it regulates, in his words, the process of coming to share in the social consciousness. And adjusting individual activity based on that shared consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction.
But he was very careful not to fall into extremes here. He saw a big pedagogical dilemma emerging, one that honestly we still argue about today.
He did. In The Child and the Curriculum, he laid out the two opposing camps.
What were they?
On one side, you had the old guard, the rigid, traditional curriculum-centered approach.
Where the subject matter is king?
The subject matter is king, the facts are fixed, and the student's job is to just be a passive vessel and absorb it all. Dewey said the big flaw here is that it treats the child as this superficial being who is to be deepened by the all-knowing curriculum.
And on the other extreme.
The extreme child-centered approach, this was adopted by some of his more, let's say, enthusiastic followers. They placed so much emphasis on the child's immediate interests that they ended up minimizing the importance of structured content and the teacher's expertise.
So he rejected both.
He saw both as incomplete. And his synthesis is just beautiful. He wrote, "The child and the curriculum are simply two limits which define a single process."
They aren't in opposition. They're two poles of the same thing.
Exactly. The teacher's job is to relate the facts and truths of the curriculum to the student's own prior experiences, to their life, to forge that vital connection that makes active inquiry possible.
So the curriculum doesn't connect to the child's life. It's just meaningless rote memorization.
Right?
But if you only follow the child's whims, there's no structure, no intellectual discipline. The teacher has to be the skilled bridge between the two.
That synthesis is the foundation of pretty much all modern effective teaching. Problem-based learning, project-based learning, hands-on science, it all comes from that idea.
And this led him to completely rethink the role of the teacher. He was deeply critical of the purely vocational view of education.
The idea that you're just training kids for a specific job in a factory or an office.
Yeah, just imparting a limited set of skills that an employer needs.
He found that view to be profoundly anti-democratic. Because if that's all schools do, they're basically preparing students for docile compliance with authoritarian work and political structures.
You're limiting their ability to think for themselves, and so you're stifling their ability to participate in social reform.
Which means the teacher, as a social service provider, has this much more profound democratic responsibility. The goal isn't to produce future workers. It's to produce what he called psychological and social goods.
Those goods being intelligence, skill, and character.
Those are the big three. And the urgency here is that this had to be focused on the present life of the child, not some imaginary future.
Because the future is unpredictable.
He knew that. He wrote that because of the pace of change, it's impossible to foretell definitely just what civilization will be 20 years from now. So training for a specific job today is probably pointless. The teacher's real business is to cultivate the intelligence and character needed for the child to live an intelligent, moral, democratic life right now.
Okay, let's go deeper on the specific attributes he saw in a successful teacher. He really separated the true professional from a mere technician. Let's start with a teacher's knowledge.
Right, and for him, this wasn't about being a walking encyclopedia.
Mhm.
He stressed that a teacher doesn't have to be a high-class scholar in every subject they teach. That's an impossible standard.
That's that.
Instead, they must have an unusual love and aptitude in some one subject. It could be history, math, science, art, whatever.
And that passion for one area gives them a kind of intellectual compass for all the others, a general feel for what genuine information and real inquiry look like.
Exactly. If you know what true discovery feels like in your own field, you can guide it in others. And this has to be a constant process, a lifelong study of the classroom, of children, of methods. And he also believed that learning is incomplete unless it is shared. A great teacher has this natural burning desire to communicate what they know.
Okay, next up is a teacher's skill. This isn't about, having neat handwriting on the board.
No, it's much deeper. He said the best indicator of a quality teacher is their ability to watch and respond to the movement of the mind with keen awareness.
So it's about observation and connection.
It's about intellectual empathy. He said the best teachers, even those with no formal training, possess a quick, sure, and unflagging sympathy with their students. Their minds can move in harmony with the students' minds.
They can anticipate the difficulties, feel the confusion, and celebrate the breakthroughs.
Yes, they see learning not as delivering a lesson, but as navigating a complex, shared transactional inquiry.
And finally, the foundation for all of it, a teacher's disposition.
This was paramount for him. He put teaching on the same social level as the ministry or parenting. He said no amount of knowledge or skill can make up for a deficiency in personal traits.
You have to have an indispensable passion for the work.
And the mental fortitude to handle the stress, the long hours, the low pay, the sheer difficulty of it. This goes back to his instrumentalism. If your internal state, your disposition, is dysfunctional, you cannot perform your function effectively.
And he had this vivid image of the consequences, the careworn teachers, with anxiety depicted on the lines of their faces, reflected in their strained, high-pitched voices and sharp manners.
And that negative demeanor, he warned, actively prevents children from learning and makes them afraid to be curious. The teacher becomes a barrier to inquiry instead of a guide.
All of which led him to have some pretty strong opinions on teacher education programs.
He thought they were focusing on the wrong things. They shouldn't be obsessed with producing proficient practitioners of mechanical skills like lesson planning or discipline technique.
Because those are things you learn on the job.
You can and you should learn them over time. He drew this brilliant long-term contrast.
The teacher who only has the mechanical skills, they look great in their first year.
Exactly. They have the basic operations down, so they appear superior. But that teacher, who just keeps perfecting the skills they already have, he wrote, may continue to improve in the mechanics of school management, but he cannot grow as a teacher, an inspirer, and director of soul life.
Whereas the teacher who has the deeper intellectual grounding might struggle a bit at first, but has the potential for real growth.
Because the goal of teacher education, for Dewey, must be to produce professional students of education, people who have a deep-seated propensity to inquire about everything, the subjects, the methods, the very activity of the mind. That spirit of perpetual inquiry is the true professional spirit, just like in law or medicine.
That concept, cultivating active inquiry, it's the perfect bridge to his vision for the larger democratic sphere. The adult citizenry needed to practice the same habits of reflective thinking he wanted in the classroom.
Yes, He argued that a complete democracy requires a fully formed public opinion, which can only be accomplished through communication.
Which brings us to the big question. What did he think the media's role was in all this?
His major work here is The Public and Its Problems from 1927. And it's really an exercise in applying his instrumental and transactional logic to politics. He starts, as always, by defining his terms. He had a very specific definition of a public.
It's not a fixed group of people.
No. A public is a spontaneous group that forms because they all share in the indirect effects of a particular action.
So a factory pollutes a river. The people downstream who are affected by that pollution, whether they're fishermen or just homeowners, they now share a common problem. They become a public.
Precisely. They have a shared interest in controlling those consequences. And because life is complex, publics are constantly forming, overlapping, and dissolving. They're dynamic. And this understanding formed the basis of his famous rebuttal of the journalist Walter Lippmann.
Right. Lippmann had written The Phantom Public, which took a very dim view of the average citizen.
Very pessimistic. Lippmann basically argued that political issues were too complex and the public was too distracted and uninformed to deal with them. So all the important thinking should be left to experts and elites.
A top-down model. The media's job is to tell people what the experts think.
And Dewey, of course, argued for the complete opposite. It reflects his deep faith in the common person as long as they're educated for inquiry.
He believed politics is the duty of each individual.
Yes. And the knowledge needed for that, Dewey, has to be generated by the interaction of everyone. Citizens, elites, experts, all mediated by journalism. In this model, it's not just the government that's held accountable. The citizens and the experts are also accountable to the process of inquiry itself.
So journalism has to completely change its focus, from spectacle to inquiry.
It's a radical shift. He said journalism needs to move away from just covering actions or happenings, who's winning the horse race, who committed the crime, and move toward discussing alternatives, choices, consequences, and conditions.
So the news should function more like a tool for teaching reflective thinking, giving people the context they need to form an intelligent opinion.
That's it exactly. It's the only way to foster a real conversation and improve the public's generation of knowledge. The goal is to replace the passive audience with active collaborators.
And the ultimate prize, the societal payoff for this kind of communication.
He believed that this kind of communication was the only thing that could convert what he called the Great Society, this massive, disconnected populace driven by industrial forces, into a great community.
A community bound by shared interests and shared inquiry.
Yes. He wrote, "The clear consciousness of a communal life in all its implications constitutes the idea of democracy. And that can only happen with free and full intercommunication." That was the crucial role he saw for journalism and education.
And it's so clear that for him, this wasn't just theory. He was deeply engaged politically and socially his entire life. He really put his instrumentalism into practice.
From very early on. And he was often quite radical for his time. Take the 1894 Pullman strike when he was at the University of Chicago. His private letters from that time show these incredibly strong pro-labor, anti-establishment views.
He was furious with the ruling class.
He was. He wrote, and this is an amazing quote, "The only wonder is that when the higher classes, damn them, take such views, there aren't more downright socialists." He was even worried that the university itself, funded by people like Rockefeller, was a capitalistic institution that was at odds with his democratic ideals.
And his engagement wasn't just local, it was global.
Oh, absolutely. His trip to China from 1919 to 1921 was hugely influential. He was invited by some of his former students, including Hu Shi, who was a leading intellectual. He ended up staying for 2 years and gave nearly 200 lectures.
And the people there called him the American Confucius.
They did. And he was giving them this advice during an incredibly volatile time in China. His core message, his instrumental advice, was to base their transformation on education and social reform, that slow, experimental process of democratic inquiry, not on a violent, dogmatic revolution.
It's fascinating that a young Mao Zedong was in the audience for one of those lectures.
It is. Mao was a library assistant at Peking University at the time. He certainly went in a different direction.
He also took his ideas to South Africa in 1934.
He did. He was invited to speak on educational reform, and there, his secular democratic ideas were just flat out rejected by the white-only government, which included some of the future architects of apartheid.
They weren't interested in an education system that fostered universal intelligence and equality.
Not in the slightest.
Mm-hmm.
But the black population and their white allies were incredibly receptive. They saw the potential of his ideas as a path toward liberation.
And back in the U.S., he was involved in some major civil rights and political fights.
He was. He was a co-founder of the NAACP and sat on its early executive board. And then there was the famous Dewey Commission in 1937.
The one that investigated the charges made against Leon Trotsky by Stalin during the Moscow trials.
Yes. And that must have been an incredibly fraught, politically charged situation.
How did his philosophy apply there?
It was pure applied instrumentalism. Dewey wasn't a communist, he wasn't a Trotskyist, but he agreed to lead the commission because he was determined to apply the most rigorous standards of reflective thinking and objective inquiry to find the truth.
And their conclusion?
The commission concluded that the charges against Trotsky were a complete fabrication. He prioritized the process of open inquiry over any political allegiance. That's his democratic faith in its highest form.
And he was consistent across the board. Women's rights, economic justice.
Absolutely. A staunch advocate for women's suffrage, arguing that a woman's place is determined by her environment and education, not by some fixed biology, a total rejection of that old self-action thinking. He was president of the League for Industrial Democracy and a big supporter of Henry George's ideas on land value tax. For him, intellectual engagement with these issues was just part of being an ethical citizen.
So after all this, what does it all mean? We've traced this single thread from technical philosophy through psychology to a total reformation of education and a new vision for journalism and a political life. He was a true polymath.
He was, and all of that massive output consistently converges on this one vital necessity. The active, experimental, democratic application of intelligence to solve human problems.
He really provided the intellectual architecture for a democratic life that goes way beyond just the ballot box.
And his influence is it's immense. People like Carl Rogers in psychology, B.R. Ambedkar, who was the Law and Justice Minister of India and helped frame their constitution, they were all drawing on Dewey's blueprint for how an intelligent, cooperative community should function.
We should also note his personal journey on religion. He moved from a very evangelical upbringing to becoming an atheist and a secular humanist later in life.
He did. He was one of the original signatories of the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933. And his view of humanism was that it was an expansion, not a contraction, of human life, where science is made the willing servant of human good.
It's a perfect summary of his entire philosophy, using instrumental reason to serve human flourishing in a democratic context.
It really is.
But there was a common criticism of his work, which the sources note, that for all his sweeping ideals, he often didn't provide systematic, detailed strategies for how to achieve them, how to actually win women's suffrage or fix the massive economic problems of his day. He knew about entrenched power, but he wasn't tactical revolutionary.
And that's the central tension, isn't it? But it's a tension that's built into his own philosophy. Instrumentalism explicitly rejects fixed, predetermined, dogmatic plans. It relies on experimental intelligence and constant revision.
So if his core belief is that the responsibility for thinking has to be distributed to everyone, not concentrated in a few leaders,
then asking him for the perfect 10-point plan would be asking him to violate his own deepest conviction. The whole point is that there is no perfect plan. We have to discover the path through the process of inquiry itself.
So his philosophy is less about providing the final answer and more about providing the tools for a perpetual search.
Exactly. The final plan for a perfect democracy is an impossibility because society is always changing, always creating new problems that need new inquiries.
Which leaves a really important question for you, the listener, to think about. If Dewey's whole philosophy rests on this idea of experimental intelligence and constant revision, does the real test of his ideas lie not in the perfection of his theory, but in the perpetual, messy, imperfect struggle of its application by all the countless citizens and journalists and teachers who came after him? And maybe, what is the limit of a theory like that when it comes up against entrenched power that simply refuses to engage in that kind of inquiry?
That's John Dewey, a true giant whose influence on how we think, how we learn, and how we try to live together democratically is still unfolding right now. Something for you to mull over on your own.